In early 1942, the harsh Russian winter set the stage for a brutal confrontation. The German 16th Army, deeply entrenched in the Demyansk Pocket, found themselves surrounded by massive Soviet forces. This was not just a battle for territory, but a battle for survival. This isolated pocket of German resistance, approximately 100,000 men strong, faced the formidable challenge of holding their ground against the Soviet onslaught. Cut off from their main supply lines, the Germans were forced to rely on a precarious lifeline, aerial resupply missions conducted by the Luftwaffe. The Soviet forces, under the command of General Timoshenko, were determined to crush the pocket and eliminate the German presence. The Red Army launched wave after wave of attacks, hoping to break the German defense and achieve a decisive victory. These soldiers, whether German or Soviet, shared a common struggle. Their humanity shone through in moments of compassion and resilience, even in the face of such dire circumstances. The Soviet dictator's grand plan was thwarted by a combination of rigid command structures and poor coordination among Soviet forces, along with Hitler's no-retreat order and the staunch resistance of the German troops. Both the Germans and the Soviets suffered heavily due to the decisions made by their leaders. The main objective of the Soviet winter offensive, which began in December 1941, was to eliminate the German threat to Moscow posed by General Feldmarschall Fedor von Bock's Army Group Center. The Soviet victory in the battle for Moscow dealt a significant blow to the perception of German invincibility, leading Stalin and the Soviet High Command, Stavka, to become overly optimistic and ambitious. Consequently, Stavka extended the offensive along the entire Eastern Front from northern Finland to the Black Sea. The goals were to destroy the Army Group Center, relieve Leningrad, and drive the Germans out of Crimea and the Donetsk Basin. In hindsight, it is evident that the Soviet objectives were overly ambitious. Although the battle for Moscow was a significant setback for the Germans, they were not as devastated and exhausted as the Soviets had assumed. The Soviet strategy of attacking on multiple fronts diluted their efforts and extended the conflict through the spring thaw, which created conditions that favoured the defenders. This allowed the Germans to mount an extraordinary defence in harsh winter conditions for which they were ill prepared. Both sides suffered heavily. From January to March 1942, the Soviets lost an astonishing 620,000 soldiers, while the German death toll was around 136,000. This disparity remained consistent when considering total casualties, including those wounded, captured, and missing. Additionally, the Soviet mobility, operational effectiveness, and supply chains were not yet capable of sustaining such large-scale offensives over extended distances. Reflecting on these events, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov noted angrily in his memoirs, "If you consider our losses and what results were achieved, it will be clear that it was a Pyrrhic victory." The Soviet strategy to wear down the Germans proved ineffective, resulting in substantial losses with minimal territorial gains. Consequently, the Soviets had to rebuild their weakened forces in anticipation of a German summer offensive which they believed would target Moscow. However, when the Germans launched their main offensive in the south, they found the Soviet military in a vulnerable position similar to the previous year. This vulnerability was largely due to the scattered Soviet efforts during the winter and spring. On both sides of the boundary between Army Group Center and North, the Soviets managed to penetrate deeply into the German front. At one point it seemed they might encircle the 9th Army and the 3rd Panzer Army. However, this potential disaster was averted, and Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge, who took command of Army Group Center after Bock's relief in early 1942, even managed to push the Soviets back in some areas. Despite this, the Soviets controlled a significant bulge extending into German lines around Toropets in the northern part of Army Group Center's sector. This bulge also extended into Army Group North's sector, stretching from Kholm in the southwest to Demyansk, a city located about 100 miles south of Leningrad in the northeast. Army Group North, led by Feldmarschall Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, consisted of 2 armies. The 18th, under General Georg von Küchler, positioned in the north around Leningrad with its front extending south to Lake Ilmen's northern shore, and the 16th, under General Ernst Busch, covering the sector from Lake Ilmen to near Kholm. During the Soviet winter offensive, 9 Soviet armies launched an attack against Army Group North, aiming to break the siege of Leningrad and push the German front away from Moscow by targeting the strategic Valdai Hills, with hopes of encircling and destroying Küchler's and Busch's forces. The 16th Army was connected to the 59th Corps of Army Group Center near Kholm, with a long front incorporating a large salient extending toward the Valdai Hills. The front ran northeastward from Kholm, east past Demyansk, and then west-northwest to Staraya Russa, south of Lake Ilmen. During the 1941 German drive eastward, the 16th Army's II Corps, led by Lieutenant General Walter Graf Brockdorff-Ahlenfeld, captured Demyansk, reached the strategic Valdai Hills, and cut the railway between Moscow and Leningrad. However, they became stuck and held these forward positions throughout the early winter, despite the Soviets' focused efforts on the salient, which protruded eastward for over 60 miles from the main German line of resistance. The elongated salient was crucial to both the Germans and the Soviets for similar reasons. Hitler and the OKH Oberkommando des Heeres saw it as an ideal jumping-off point for a potential resumed offensive against Moscow. Aware of this, Stavka considered the Demyansk salient as a dagger pointed at Moscow due to their misinterpretation of German intentions. Additionally, the salient posed a serious flank threat to the large bulge the Soviets had driven into the Army Group Center in the Toropets-Velikie Luki area. If the Germans launched a southward offensive from the Demyansk Salient while Army Group Center advanced northward, they could encircle a large pocket of Soviet forces. Despite recognizing the strategic opportunities presented by the Toropets bulge and the overextension of their enemy, the Germans were unable to act on them. The German armies were severely depleted from the 1941 offensive and the subsequent Soviet winter counter-offensive. Replacements were slow to arrive, and there were virtually no reserves. General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of the 9th Army, reported that his battalions were down to about 70 men each, with only 7 light and heavy machine guns on average. The Demyansk salient, crucial to both sides, became one of the most fiercely contested areas of the Eastern Front. Brockdorff-Ahlenfeld, the 54-year-old aristocrat and seasoned commander of the 16th Army's 2nd Corps, was tasked with defending it. Having joined the German army in 1907 and distinguished himself during the French campaign of 1940, he faced the challenge of holding this critical position. In January 1942, when the Soviet offensive targeted Army Group North, Brockdorff-Ahlenfeld's 2nd Corps consisted of 3 divisions: the 12th Infantry Division from Mecklenburg, the 32nd Infantry Division from Pomerania and Prussia, and the 123rd Infantry Division from Brandenburg. These divisions had been involved in the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union and, due to the intense fighting and eastward push, were significantly under strength. Additionally, the soldiers faced extreme cold with temperatures dropping below -40°F while still wearing summer uniforms. This severely hindered both personnel and equipment. Although frontline troops received some extra clothing from rear area personnel, it was insufficient, as those in the rear also lacked proper winter gear. The Soviet Northwest Front, led by Pavel Kurochkin, aimed to encircle the northern flank of the 16th Army through two major offensives involving troops from both the Northwest Front and the Kalinin Front. The northern offensive comprised three armies. Morozov's 11th Army targeted the Lake Ilmen area, Nikolai Bersarin's 34th Army focused on the Valdai Hills, and the 1st Shock Army participated in the drive. The southern offensive comprised the 53rd Army, commanded by Alexander Xenofontov, the 22nd Army under Yashkevich, and the 3rd Shock Army. These units aimed to break through to Kholm and form the southern pincer to encircle Demyansk. Their efforts were bolstered by extensive partisan activities in the German rear, especially around Staraya Russa. The northern attack began on January 7, 1942, led by the 11th Soviet Army, elements of the 1st Shock Army, and two Guards Rifle Corps, 1st and 2nd, from Stavka's Strategic Reserve. On January 9th, the 3rd Shock Army from the Kalinin Front, along with the 53rd and 22nd Armies, launched an offensive westward towards Kholm and Lake Seliger, on the boundary between Army Group Centre and Army Group North. A successful breakthrough here would enable the Soviets to penetrate the rear areas of both German army groups. The German 10th Corps, commanded by General Christian Hansen and positioned on the left flank of the 2nd Corps, was driven back by relentless Soviet pressure. 10th Corps, like 2nd Corps, consisted of three divisions: the 30th Infantry Division from Schleswig-Holstein under General Kurt von Tippelskirch, the 290th Infantry Division from Hanover and Schleswig-Holstein under General Theodor Freiherr von Wrede, and the 3rd SS Totenkopf Division, led by the ruthless SS Obergruppenführer Theodor Eicke. These divisions were all eventually pushed into the Demyansk Salient.
Schicken Sie uns ein MG-42-Krupp.
Sagen Sie dem Kommandostab, wir greifen an. Sie sollen Verstärkung schicken.
Aufteilen! Feldwebel, übernehmen Sie mit 3 Männern die Flanke. Ich gebe Ihnen Feuerschutz.
Überprüfen Sie die Waffen. Wir wollen diesmal keine Ladehemmungen.
On the night of January 7th to 8th, Soviet forces infiltrated between the 290th and 30th Infantry Divisions. By dawn, strong Soviet infantry and tank formations were behind the 290th Infantry Division. Soviet transport gliders also landed troops and tanks on the frozen Lake Ilmen. These forces crossed the ice and reached the junction of the Levati, Redya and Polisti rivers, 25 miles behind the 290th Division. In total, 19 Soviet infantry divisions, 9 brigades and several independent ski and tank battalions launched attacks on the fronts of both 10th and 2nd Corps, creating significant pressure and further complicating the German defence. The primary offensive of the 11th Soviet Army focused on the front of the 290th Division near Tutulovo. To the north, German forces mounted a desperate defence but were ultimately overrun in brutal fighting. The right flank of the division managed to hold out for another day before collapsing under the intense Soviet assault. As the 290th Division withdrew westward to avoid encirclement, it faced fierce battles around various towns and strong points along the way. Meanwhile, the 1st and 2nd Soviet Guards Corps advanced southward behind the 290th Infantry Division. The 2nd Guards attacked Parfino, while the 1st Guards moved towards Saluege, with Soviet ski troops approaching Staraya Russa. In a bid to counter this advance, the Germans hastily assembled a makeshift defence force comprising rear area troops to try and hold back the Soviet onslaught. Additionally, the 51st Infantry Regiment of the 18th Motorized Infantry Division was brought in from Simsk in an effort to stabilise the rapidly deteriorating situation. Despite these efforts, the German units were under significant pressure, facing well-coordinated Soviet attacks aimed at exploiting their weakened positions. The combination of relentless Soviet offensives, the strategic importance of the region and the harsh winter conditions created a challenging scenario for the German defenders, who struggled to maintain their lines and prevent a complete collapse. The intense fighting and the strategic manoeuvring by both sides underscored the critical nature of this front in the broader context of the Eastern Front battles. The 290th Division found itself encircled and could only be resupplied by air after January 25th. Despite the dire circumstances, the division managed to repel 146 enemy attacks between January 8th and February 13th. With a superhuman effort, they finally broke out of the encirclement on February 13th. Meanwhile, the front held by 2nd Corps was also collapsing. The Soviets concentrated their main offensive on the boundary between army groups north and centre. On January 9th, after a 2-hour artillery bombardment, they launched a massive attack. 6 rifle divisions, supported by several tank and ski battalions, targeted positions on either side of Ostashkov near Lake Seliger. The ferocity and scale of the Soviet assault overwhelmed the German defences, further destabilising the already precarious situation. The relentless Soviet offensive severely strained the German lines. The combination of intense artillery barrages, infantry assaults, and the strategic use of tank and ski battalions exploited the vulnerabilities between the two army groups. German forces struggled to regroup and mount an effective defence faced with the dual challenges of the harsh winter and relentless Soviet pressure. The successful encirclement and eventual breakout of the 290th Division, coupled with the collapsing the 2 Corps front, illustrated the desperate and chaotic nature of the fighting. The Germans were forced into a reactive stance, constantly trying to patch up breaches and reinforce critical points along the front. The overall strategic picture for the Germans grew increasingly bleak as Soviet forces continued their aggressive push, aiming to exploit every weakness and achieve a decisive breakthrough. The 53rd Army, along with elements of the 22nd Army and the 3rd Shock Army, launched a powerful offensive that decimated 2 regiments of the 123rd Infantry Division, creating a significant breach that allowed Soviet troops to flood through. At the same time, the 34th Soviet Army, bolstered by 2 airborne brigades, intensified its pressure on the salient from the east. By January 12th, General Brockdorff-Ahlenfeld was granted permission to withdraw the easternmost segment of his front in response to the mounting Soviet threat. Upon his appointment as the commander of all German forces within the pocket, General Hansen, the 10th Corps commander, was transferred to Staraya Russa without his divisions to take command of the German forces there. This strategic shift underscored the critical nature of the situation and the need for experienced leadership to manage the defence. The German-held salient around Demyansk, described by US Army historian Earl Ziemke as resembling a misplaced thumb on the map, was under severe threat from multiple directions. The Soviet 34th Army pressed from the east, while the base of the salient faced concerted attacks from the 1st Shock Army in the north and the 3rd Shock Army and 53rd Army in the south. The intense pressure from these coordinated Soviet offensives jeopardized the integrity of the German defenses, creating a highly precarious situation.
Sagen Sie dem Kommandostab, wir greifen an. Sie sollen Verstärkung schicken.
Panzerkommando und Bunker 6. Geben Sie Fliegeralarm.
Despite the dire circumstances, the German forces fought tenaciously to hold their positions. The Soviets' strategic aim was clear: to cut off and encircle the German troops, thereby eliminating a significant portion of their fighting strength in the region. The harsh winter conditions added to the challenges faced by the German defenders as they struggled to maintain supply lines and reinforce their positions amid the relentless Soviet assaults. The unfolding battle for the Demyansk Salient highlighted the broader strategic importance of this region in the Eastern Front conflict. Both sides recognized the critical nature of controlling this area, leading to fierce and protracted combat. The German efforts to stabilize their lines and the Soviet determination to achieve a decisive breakthrough set the stage for a brutal and drawn-out confrontation with significant implications for the wider war effort. Operationally, the OKH saw the pocket as serving two potential purposes, keeping Russian troops occupied and potentially acting as one arm of an encircling manoeuvre against the Toropets Bulge. However, the feasibility and intent behind such an operation were in question. Feldmarschall Ritter von Lieb argued that without a clear plan or the ability to execute it, the pocket held no value. Deeply concerned about the deteriorating situation on his front, Lieb contacted Führer headquarters on January 12th, proposing a withdrawal of his armies behind the WWII River. Predictably, Hitler rejected the proposal. Determined, Lieb flew to East Prussia to present his case in person, but Hitler refused again. Frustrated, Lieb requested to be relieved of his command, to which Hitler agreed. General Georg Karl Friedrich Wilhelm von Küchler was appointed as the new commander of the army group, and General Georg Lindemann replaced Küchler as commander of the 18th Army. By mid-January, the southern front of the 16th Army had effectively collapsed. The severely battered 123rd Infantry Division was reduced to defending isolated strongpoints near Molvotosyn, with its 415th and 416th Infantry regiments cut off from the rest of the front. In 10 days of fierce fighting, these regiments managed to fight their way back through enemy lines to rejoin the main front. When they finally arrived, their combined strength was reduced to just 900 men. This series of events underscored the critical situation facing the German forces. The strategic significance of the Demyansk Pocket was overshadowed by the harsh reality on the ground. The relentless Soviet offensives and the severe winter conditions strained the German defences to their limits. Lieb's unsuccessful attempts to secure a strategic withdrawal highlighted the inflexibility of Hitler's command decisions and the dire consequences for the troops on the front lines. The appointment of new commanders was a desperate move to stabilise the situation, but the overall strategic position remained precarious as the Soviets continued to press their advantage. The 32nd Infantry Division, Wilhelm Bonstedt, and the 123rd Infantry Division, Erwin Rauch from Brandenburg, eventually managed to establish a temporary southern front spanning 118 miles. However, their combined strength had drastically reduced to about 12,000 men. The Soviets were unable to fully exploit their initial successes because isolated German units had established strong points in villages bypassed by the initial Soviet assaults. These strong points forced follow-on Russian units to divert forces to deal with them. Some strong points were overtaken while others held out for weeks, their desperate resistance helping to stabilise the front temporarily. The situation grew increasingly dire as the Second Corps faced the threat of encirclement. Fresh Soviet divisions poured into the 56-mile-wide gap in the south, compelling Bonstedt's and Rauch's divisions to fall back. In a message to the 16th Army, the Second Corps indicated, their intention to withdraw behind the WWII River at the earliest opportunity. The response from OKH was blunt and unequivocal. Demyansk was to be defended to the last man. This situation highlighted the severe challenges faced by the German forces. The combined strength of Bonstedt's and Rauch's divisions had been severely diminished, yet they managed to construct a defensive line. The desperate standby isolated strongpoints slowed the Soviet advance, buying critical time for the Germans to attempt to stabilize their front. Nevertheless, the threat of encirclement loomed large over the Second Corps. The influx of fresh Soviet divisions into the southern gap exacerbated the precariousness of their position. The rigid command from OKH to hold Demyansk at all costs reflected the high stakes and the desperation of the German high command. The insistence on defending the pocket to the last man underscored the critical nature of the battle and the immense pressure on the German forces to hold their ground against overwhelming odds. The 2nd Corps withdrew all battalions under SS Obergruppenführer Eicker's command and quickly transported them to the Saluhe area to fortify the Western Front. These combat groups established a defensive line to prevent the Soviets from cutting the salient near its base. Their timely arrival was crucial as the 34th Soviet Army and the 1st Guards Corps converged near Rambushevo on the Levati River on February 8th. This action transformed the Demyansk Salient into the Demyansk Pocket, trapping approximately 100,000 German troops. By January 23rd, the city of Kholm, located about 56 miles southwest of Demyansk, was encircled by the 3rd Shock Army. The recently arrived 81st Silesian Infantry Division, newly assigned to Army Group Center's sector, was immediately dispatched north toward Kholm. Despite lacking winter clothing and equipment, these troops managed to repel the attacks of 4 Soviet divisions in temperatures as low as -46 degrees Fahrenheit. This fierce defence temporarily disrupted the offensive of the 4th Shock Army, though the overall situation remained critical. The withdrawal and rapid redeployment of Eicker's battalions were essential in preventing the Soviets from severing the salient entirely. The convergence of Soviet forces on February 8th marked a significant escalation, turning the salient into a besieged pocket with a substantial number of German troops at risk of annihilation. In Kholm, the 81st Silesian Infantry Division's stand against the encircling Soviet forces highlighted the extreme conditions and desperation of the German defence. Fighting in severe cold without adequate winter gear, these soldiers' ability to repel multiple Soviet divisions was a remarkable, albeit temporary, achievement. However, the strategic situation remained dire, with German forces under immense pressure from the relentless Soviet offensives. The transformation of the Demyansk Salient into a pocket signified a critical juncture in the Eastern Front battles, with the Germans facing increasingly insurmountable odds. Kholm played a crucial role in slowing the Soviet advance. Had the Germans lost the city, the Soviets could have penetrated the rear of both Army Group Center and the 16th Army. Theodor Scherer, commander of the lightly armed 281st Security Division, was appointed commandant of Fortress Kholm. He assembled a force of around 5,000 troops from whatever units he could muster. By the end of January, contact between the Kholm garrison and neighbouring German units was severed, turning Kholm, like Demyansk, into a pocket that could only be resupplied by air. In the Demyansk Pocket, Brockdorf-Ahlenfeldt's 6 divisions were strategically positioned. The 12th Mecklenburg and 32nd Pomeranian Infantry Divisions held positions to the east and south of Demyansk, while remnants of the 123rd Infantry Division fought in the southwest sector. The 30th and 290th Infantry Divisions from northern Germany defended the northern part of the pocket, and part of the SS Totenkopf Division under SS Standartenführer Max Simon was stationed in the northeast. Combat groups under SS Obergruppenführer Eicker were positioned in the west. The Demyansk Pocket covered an area of 1,265 square miles, with a front line stretching approximately 186 miles and a width ranging from 30 to 45 miles. The logistical nightmare of supplying these isolated pockets by air added to the strain on German resources and morale. The continuous Soviet pressure and the harsh winter conditions compounded the difficulties faced by the German defenders. Despite these challenges, the defense of Kholm and Demyansk became emblematic of the German determination to hold critical positions on the Eastern Front, reflecting the broader struggle and the high stakes of the conflict. In his initial order of the day after the formation of the pocket, Brockdorf-Ahlenfeldt boldly declared, "There are 96,000 of us. The German soldier is superior to the Russian. This has been proven. So, let the difficult times come. We are ready." But in reality, the Germans were not superior at all in the fight in Russia. Unlike the earlier pocket at Sukhanichi, Hitler was adamant about not abandoning Kholm or Demyansk. After receiving assurances from the Luftwaffe that the reinforced 1st Air Fleet could deliver the necessary 265 tons of daily supplies to sustain the 2 pockets, Hitler commanded that both be held until they could be relieved. Brockdorf-Ahlenfeldt's defiant proclamation aimed to bolster the morale of his encircled troops, emphasizing their proven superiority and readiness to face adversity. This statement underscored the high stakes and the determination of the German forces to maintain their positions despite the encirclement. The situation in the pockets was bad, with troops having to rely heavily on the aerial supply drops for essentials like food, ammunition and medical supplies. Despite the Luftwaffe's efforts, the supply lines were precarious and any disruption could have catastrophic consequences for the encircled soldiers. The defence of Kholm and Demyansk thus became not just a military necessity but also a fight for survival. These drops meant the soldiers could drink and eat.
The snow is relentless, an endless white sea that stretches as far as the eye can see, swallowing everything in its icy grip. It's been weeks since we found ourselves encircled here in the Demyansk Pocket, and every day feels like an eternity. We are the 16th Army, trapped and battered, yet still holding on. The cold is constant, gnawing at our bones and sapping our strength. Frostbite claims fingers and toes, and the bitter wind cuts through even the thickest of our winter coats. At night the temperature plummets, and we huddle together for warmth, the breath of our comrades visible in the air as we share meager rations and tales of home. Our positions are under constant threat. The Soviets push us from all sides, testing our defenses and probing for weaknesses. We have lost many good men, friends and brothers in arms who now lie frozen in the snow, their sacrifice a testament to our struggle. Each day we dig deeper into the earth, fortifying our trenches, hoping to hold our ground against the next onslaught. I remember Hans, a jovial fellow from Munich who used to play the harmonica at night. He's gone now, taken by a sniper's bullet. Then there's Dieter, a young recruit, barely out of school. He was so full of hope when we first arrived, but the horrors of war have aged him beyond his years. Yesterday he carried the lifeless body of his best friend Peter back to our lines. The look in his eyes was hollow, as if a part of him had died too. Supplies are coming, but still not enough. The Luftwaffe attempts airdrops, but some fall into Soviet hands or are lost in the vast wilderness. We ration everything: food, ammunition, medical supplies. The thought of a warm meal and a soft bed seems like a distant dream, a memory from another life. Despite the hardships, there is a grim determination among us. We fight not just for survival, but for each other. Comradeship is our lifeline. The man next to you in the trench is your brother, your confidant. We share stories of better times, laugh when we can, and console each other in the darkest moments. Every morning we brace ourselves for the day ahead. The Russians are relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. We hear the distant rumble of artillery, the crack of rifles, the shouts of men. Each attack is a test of our resolve. We hold our positions, our faces grim, our hearts steeled against the fear that threatens to overwhelm us. As I write this, I can hear the sounds of battle in the distance. Another Soviet assault, another day of fighting for our lives. The future is uncertain and survival is not guaranteed. But for now, we hold the line, fighting for every inch of frozen ground, for every breath we take. In this hellish landscape, amidst the suffering and death, there is still hope. Hope that we will be relieved, that we will survive this ordeal, and that one day we will return to our families and homes. Until then, we endure, we fight, we survive.
On February 18th, the OKH ordered the redeployment of the Air Transport Command from the Smolensk area to Luftflotte 1's operational zone, mobilizing nearly all of the Luftwaffe's transport capacity, along with elements of its bomber force. This extensive operation was necessary to supply the Demyansk Pocket, which had 2 usable airfields at Demyansk and Pesky, facilitating both airdrop and air landing glider missions. Despite an improvement in the weather in mid-February, considerable snow still covered the ground. Nevertheless, supply operations were largely successful due to the relatively weak presence of Soviet air forces in the region. The Luftwaffe conducted 33,000 sorties until the Demyansk Pocket was evacuated in March 1943. Throughout the operation, the pockets of Demyansk and Kholm received 59,000 tons of supplies via ground and air. Additionally, 31,000 replacement troops were flown in and 36 wounded soldiers were evacuated. However, these operations came at a significant cost to the Luftwaffe. They lost 265 aircraft, but more critically, 387 experienced airmen were lost. On the Soviet side, the Air Force reportedly lost 408 aircraft, including 243 fighters. This extensive airlift operation demonstrated the Luftwaffe's logistical capabilities and the high stakes of maintaining the encircled German positions. The efforts to keep the pockets supplied and reinforced underscored the strategic importance placed on holding these areas, despite the tremendous risks and losses involved. The success of the supply operations, facilitated by the relatively ineffective Soviet air opposition, allowed the Germans to maintain their defensive positions for an extended period. The evacuation of 36,000 wounded troops and the continuous inflow of replacements ensured that the German forces could endure despite being cut off from direct ground support. However, the cost of these operations was substantial. The loss of aircraft and, more importantly, the experienced airmen had a lasting impact on the Luftwaffe's operational effectiveness. The reported losses on the Soviet side, while significant, author Werner Haupt incorrectly claims that this was the first air bridge in history, while Paul Carrel notes that in 14,500 missions, apparently during the encirclement, the Ju-52 transport planes of the Luftwaffe established the first airlift in history. Similar incorrect statements have been made by other writers. In reality, during the 1940 German invasion of Norway, an air bridge had already been established from Germany and Denmark to Norway. During this operation, 582 transport aircraft flew 13,000 sorties, delivering 29,000 troops and 2,376 tons of supplies. Additionally, smaller air bridge operations occurred from Oslo to other isolated landing sites along the Norwegian coast. The Luftwaffe's success in supplying and reinforcing encircled troops in Russia, as well as evacuating casualties, convinced Hitler and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring of their ability to conduct effective airlift operations elsewhere on the Eastern Front. This confidence led Göring to propose supplying the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad by air, believing that the operation would mirror the success at Demyansk and Kholm. They theorized that sustained airlifts would allow the German forces to hold out long enough for a regrouping and counterattack, as the Soviets would need to extend their strength to maintain the encirclement. However, the conditions at Stalingrad differed significantly from those at Demyansk. In Demyansk, a single corps with about 6 understrength divisions required around 265 tons of supplies daily, whereas the 6th Army at Stalingrad needed approximately 800 tons each day, delivered over much greater distances. Additionally, the Soviet air forces were better organized and more effective by the time of the Stalingrad encirclement. By the winter of 1942-1943, the German air transport forces had already suffered substantial losses, and the distances to well-equipped airfields for maintenance and repairs were far greater. Consequently, the Luftwaffe lacked the necessary resources to sustain the Stalingrad airlift. After Hitler refused to permit a withdrawal behind the Levati River, Ernst Busch's 16th Army began planning an operation to break into the Demyansk Pocket from the west. General Walter Kurt von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 12th Infantry Division, was appointed to lead this effort. Seydlitz, who would later be captured at Stalingrad and become a prominent figure in a Soviet-sponsored anti-Nazi faction, commanded a formidable group for the operation. Seydlitz's group included 2 infantry divisions, 2 light infantry divisions, a motorized infantry division, a security regiment, a panzer regiment, a Luftwaffe field regiment, and various construction units, assault gun batteries, and air defense battalions. The plan called for a simultaneous westward attack from within the pocket, with the aim of the 2 forces linking up along the Levati River. The operation commenced with intense fighting as Seydlitz's forces advanced towards the Levati River. Infantry units engaged in fierce close-quarters combat with Soviet defenders, while the Panzer Regiment provided crucial armoured support, breaking through fortified positions and repelling counter-attacks. The Luftwaffe Field Regiment and air defense battalions played a vital role, providing air cover and neutralizing Soviet air threats, ensuring that supply lines remained open and operational. Meanwhile, within the Demyansk Pocket, the encircled German forces, including the SS Totenkopf division, launched their coordinated westward attack. Despite being under constant artillery and mortar fire, these troops pressed forward, determined to link up with Seydlitz's group. The men faced harrowing conditions, navigating through minefields, crossing rivers under fire, and engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat to secure key positions.
Aufteilen! Feldwebel, übernehmen Sie mit 3 Männern die Flanke! Ich gebe Ihnen Feuerschutz!
Überprüfen Sie die Waffen. Wir wollen diesmal keine Ladehemmungen. Verteilt euch! Feldwebel, übernehmen Sie mit 3 Männern die Flanke. Ich gebe Ihnen Feuerschutz.
On April 21st, 1942, Group Seydlitz-Kurzbach and the forces from within the pocket finally reached the Lovatty River near the destroyed village of Rambushevo. However, their efforts were met with a significant obstacle, the swollen and turbulent Lovatty River, which was 1,000 feet wide. This natural barrier prevented an immediate link-up between Seydlitz's spearhead and the SS Totenkopf division. Despite the proximity of the two forces, bridging the river under enemy fire proved to be an arduous task. Engineers worked tirelessly to construct makeshift bridges while under constant bombardment. The soldiers on both sides of the river provided covering fire, and several attempts were made to cross using rafts and improvised means. The fighting was fierce and relentless, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The successful construction of a bridge over the Lovatty River would eventually allow the two forces to join, creating a unified front and enabling the supply and reinforcement of the Demyansk Pocket. This operation highlighted the determination and resilience of the German troops, as well as the strategic importance of maintaining control over critical positions on the Eastern Front. Once bridges were constructed, a vital corridor was re-established between the main front of the 16th Army, stretching from Staraya Russa to Kholm and the divisions encircled in the Demyansk area. This significant achievement transformed the Demyansk Pocket back into the Demyansk Salient. The newly formed corridor effectively blocked the Soviets from crossing the land bridge between Lakes Ilmen and Seliger. With the bridges in place, German forces could transport essential supplies, reinforcements and equipment to the troops in the Demyansk salient more efficiently. This restored land connection also allowed for the evacuation of the wounded and the rotation of exhausted units, significantly bolstering the morale and combat effectiveness of the encircled forces. The re-establishment of the corridor also had strategic implications. It denied the Soviets a crucial passage, preventing them from exploiting the land bridge to launch further offensives or to cut off German supply lines. The German forces used this opportunity to fortify their positions along the corridor, setting up defensive lines and strong points to repel any Soviet attempts to break through. Initially, the Rambushevo corridor was alarmingly narrow, posing a significant risk that the Soviets could sever the salient at its base. This vulnerability prompted the Germans to undertake efforts to widen the corridor. The stakes were high, as losing the corridor would nullify the hard-fought gains and sacrifices made to establish it. The battles to secure the corridor had already cost the Germans 3,000 plus lives and resulted in over 10,000 wounded. To mitigate this risk, German forces launched operations to the Soviets, growing increasingly determined to eliminate the Demyansk salient, launched a series of desperate assaults on the thin Rambushevo corridor. Obergruppenführer Eicke was primarily responsible for keeping this vital passage open. The German forces fought desperately in sub-zero. The influential Obergruppenführer Eicke urgently requested reinforcements to sustain his forces, but neither the 16th Army nor Army Group North had any to spare. In search of available troops, the OKH decided to deploy the SS Freikorps into the salient. Freikorps Denmark, led by the charismatic Danish-Russian aristocrat Christian von Schalburg, was stationed in Posen-Tresgau, where it underwent rigorous training despite internal dissent. Schalburg transformed the unit into a well-trained battalion by integrating 10 experienced German officer instructors into key posts. Declared combat ready in May 1942, Freikorps Denmark was initially considered second-rate compared to German units, deemed suitable only for static warfare and anti-partisan fighting, which explained their lack of heavy-caliber weapons. However, this perception was about to change. On May 8th, 1942, the Freikorps was flown into the Demyansk Salient to join Eicker's SS Totenkopf division. Taking positions along the Robia River, their mission was to prevent the Soviets from expanding a bridgehead in the area of Sutoki. The Soviets had managed to establish a small bridgehead on the German-occupied side, and if they could expand it and bring over tanks, it would pose a significant threat to the defenders of the Rambushevo corridor. Danish commander Christian von Schalburg knew the Soviet bridgehead had to be destroyed. He ordered Johannes Just Nielsen, a veteran of the Winter War and one of the best officers in the Freikorps, to attack the bridgehead on the night of May 27, 28. Nielsen divided his force into two groups, approaching the Soviets from different directions. Under the cover of darkness, the Danes got close without detection, and Nielsen signalled the attack by throwing a grenade into the enemy positions. The sudden assault caused panic among the numerically superior Russians, leading to many being killed and others fleeing into the river. The operation was successful, but the Russians on the far bank retaliated with mortars and artillery, killing Nielsen. Instead of holding the captured positions, the Danes withdrew, leading to the Soviets re-establishing the bridgehead a few days later. This forced the Freikorps to launch another costly attack on June 2nd, which failed due to the lack of surprise and heavy Soviet artillery fire. Schalburg, who went forward to motivate his men, was severely wounded by a mine and subsequently killed by a Soviet barrage. Despite heavy losses, including 21 Danes killed and 58 wounded, the Soviets retained their bridgehead. Schalburg was given a hero's funeral in Denmark, inspiring more volunteers for the Freikorps. SS Obersturmbannführer Knud Berger Martinsen temporarily took command until Hans Albert von Lettow-Vorbeck, an aristocrat with experience in the SS division Wiking, was appointed as the new commander. In the meantime, parts of the SS Totenkopf division were preparing for Operation Dannebrog to secure the area up to the Polar River and establish a defensible line, with Freikorps Denmark tasked to capture the town of Bolshoye Dubovici. Von Lettow-Vorbeck arrived on June 10 and after a briefing led the Danes in a dawn assault on the town the next morning. Despite bitter enemy resistance and difficult terrain, the Danes began clearing Dubovici house by house but faced a strong Russian counterattack, resulting in the deaths of two company commanders, Boyd Hansen and Alfred Nielsen. By June 11th, the 1st Company, led by Per Sørensen, was nearly surrounded, forcing Lettow-Vorbeck to order a withdrawal. He was killed by Soviet machine gun fire, causing the Danish attack to collapse and the Soviets to retain control of WWII. The Danes suffered 25 killed in this battle, adding to over 100 casualties from earlier engagements. Obersturmbannführer Martinsen then took command permanently. In early July 1942, the depleted Freikorps defended a long front between Byakovo and Vasilievshchina against repeated Soviet attacks aimed at cutting the Rambushevo corridor. On July 16th, the Danes were hit by a heavy Russian artillery barrage followed by a massive infantry assault, putting them in danger of being overrun. Rear area personnel and Luftwaffe support were called in, and Sørensen's 1st Company, reduced to 40 men, fought fiercely. Despite several hours of intense hand-to-hand combat, the Russians withdrew after midnight. Fresh Soviet reinforcements and German Jaeger battalions arrived, leading to renewed fighting. The Soviets launched another major attack with tanks and fighter bombers, but the Danes, lacking sufficient armour, managed to repel the assault and stabilise the front. By July 21st, the crisis had subsided as Soviet forces withdrew from the northern front, having suffered significant losses. The Demyansk Pocket was a constant concern for Army Group North. On September 14, 1942, General Kukla wrote to OKH, arguing that holding the pocket was futile. He noted that the Second Corps had been fighting under adverse conditions since the previous winter and expressed concern about the approaching winter, emphasising the need for divisions in the salient to form reserves for the 16th Army and the Army Group. General Franz Helder, OKH's Chief of Staff, replied a week later, acknowledging that abandoning Demyansk would free up 12 divisions for the Army Group, but also pointed out that it would release 26 Russian infantry divisions and 7 tank brigades to attack. Nevertheless, Hitler's Haltenbefehl, hold order, remained unchanged. From November 1942, the Russians relentlessly attacked the corridor linking the pocket to the main German defensive lines. By mid-January 1943, continuous fighting had exhausted the last reserves of the Army Group. On January 19, 1943, General Kurt Zeitzler, the new OKH Chief of Staff, informed Kukla of his intention to raise the issue of evacuating the Demyansk Pocket with Hitler. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings this video to a close. As always, I truly hope you've learned something new. It was an absolute pleasure having you with me on this crazy journey. Our greatest respects to all the soldiers, Soviet, German, and from all sides, who perished in this long battle. Please remember to subscribe and like the video, it helps me a lot. You can find my Patreon link below and a big thanks to my supporters there. Also, my Instagram is linked below where I post content daily. Once again, thank you for joining me. I hope to see you on the next adventure. Goodbye for now.